And just a warning, this show does contain mental illness, abuse, and graphic violence.
First time in a place like this.
Sorry? Oh, no. Yes. I mean, in a place like this. Yes, but obviously I've been to countless other institutions before. Can they hear us?
They could if they chose. Most don't. May I ask how you do it?
Do what?
Make your judgment. How you decide whether a man is truly mad or not.
Well, it's a complicated process.
It doesn't seem complicated to me. This lot, all of them, mad as the day is long. Dangerous. Not sure why an assessment is necessary when they're dribbling like babies and howling like wolves.
Well, the mind is a complicated beast, Miss Green. They may seem damaged or disturbed, but that does not mean to say that they cannot be fixed.
There is no fixing to be done here, I can assure you. It's in their eyes. If you clean them up and put them back out there, they'll just find a way back in. You mark my words. Here he is, Ernest Hemmel.
What's he done with the window?
He has to cover it up. At night he would scream and scream and start tearing at the walls, scratching, scraping. He would damage himself quite badly. You'd have to sedate him and strap him up. Timid clever to look at. But when you hear about what he done, well, like they say, the quiet ones.
Tick, tock, tick, tock, tick, tock, ticked the clock as Ernest Hemmel sat, quiet and still, in the darkened corners of his apartment block. No light, but a slight dusting from the distant moon. Still he sat, calm and patient as he watched, rapt from his window. Eyes straining as they peered across the empty void to reach their goal. No movement, but the occasional twitch from his clammy hand, restless, revealing the inner itch that lay beneath the calm waters in which his body bathed. Tick-tock, 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 ticked past 9 on the clock, counting down the precious remaining moments of this wonderful vision. Love, he called it to himself. Devotion, a quite admirable devotion, which would one day be embraced. For his eyes were felt, he knew that much. He was but one party in this game which he shared with another. She felt him, he knew it, and every night she would sit for him as he watched her in the darkness. So still, almost like a painting. Her clean white skin, the long flow of her hair glowing underneath the light of the pale moon. They both played their parts, most willingly, waiting, each alone, but not alone, as the ticking clock counted down the moments of their nightly encounter. He would sometimes forget to breathe. Eyes traveling across the emptiness to embrace her fully. He held her tightly and dreamt of her touch. She belonged to him. Does he ever speak?
No, not to me. He just stares at that picture of his.
Who's the woman in the picture?
I believe it's his mother. Some have said it's the young girl they found, but that's probably just stories. You get a lot of that around here. People talking, as if the truth isn't enough for some people.
Miss Gwendolyn Bertram, a most divine creature, a most exquisite young maiden, glanced around at the hundreds of burnt-out candles that covered her room. Each one a different, beautiful wax figurine that had become crooked and disfigured as the candle had twinkling away like a very own special star. The stars were shy in the city in which she lived, veiled by gas and steam and smoke and cloud, reticent to be seen clearly for fear that they may be snared and snatched from their hiding places. But not the bright moon. Gwendolyn sat quietly, as she did every night, waiting for the moon to pierce the horizon of the foreboding apartment block that sat across from her window, still and menacing like a heavy hound abandoned by its master.
She felt a finger of moonlight reach down and caress her face. She smiled, blew out the candle and pulled open the curtains to let the light embrace her.
She loved the moon.
Its glow was like a balm to her broken eyes, not like the cruel, harsh sun, her captor that kept her locked inside. Too cruel for her porcelain skin, too strong for her gentle, misted eyes. Clouded pearls that felt shape and form and light, but could barely see past the confines of her room.
Unlike the sharp, hawk-like eyes that were trained upon her, as she sat, smiling gently,
She was unaware of his invasive gaze that clutched her tightly in her seat. She couldn't see into the dark window of the dark building that loomed beyond her sight. She couldn't see that in that darkness sat a man.
still, calm, patient, watching.
Looking at her with as much love as she looked upon her moon.
He watched her.
As she watched her moon, and the clock ticked and tocked,
Tick, tock, tick, tock.
until the time was up.
Next door sat a young man,
Thomas Thistle.
cursing the shrapnel that peppered the flesh of his thigh, and the pain that followed him around these days like a starving dog, clutching at his leg with the stubby fingers of a scared child.
He had spent much of his time alone in the month since his discharge from the army.
Struggling at first to cope with the sprawling randomness of life outside the military, faced with the terrifying, oppressive freedom, and the heaving lack of purpose that hung like an albatross around the neck of one's everyday existence.
He longed for some sort of companionship, a distraction, and seeing the young face of the lady who had lived next door had lifted his heart higher than it had been since moving into the building.
He had never seen anything like her.
A shock of soft white hair cascading like snowdrops from her shoulders. Her skin so white, almost translucent, but sublime in its purity, like a china door.
And those eyes.
Thomas held the small wax figure that he had spent so much time carving tightly in his hand and stared at it.
She is so close.
His eyes bored into the walls, as if through sheer will they'd be able to pierce them and rest upon her face.
He dreamt of her.
As she watched her moon,
And as she was watched from the dark building.
After a moment, he grabbed his stick and rose to his feet.
Knock, knock, knock.
tick, tock, tick, tock, tick, tock, ticked the clock as Miss Gwendolyn Bertram sat quiet and still, watching her moon.
Knock, knock, knock.
Gwendolyn's heart leapt when she heard the knocking at the door. She wasn't used to visitors.
She called out,
Hello! And was greeted by a warm, rich voice.
Hello?
Wings of butterflies beat in her stomach. Her hand trembled slightly with excitement. She rose to her feet and opened the door.
and there she found him, the man whom for some reason she had not been able to shake from her thoughts.
She smiled. Hello.
Hello. My name is Thomas Thistle. I'm from next door.
Oh yes, I remember. My name is Gwendolyn.
Well, it's silly, really. I wondered if you might want some company.
tick, tock, tick, tock, ticked the clock as Ernest Hemel sat, quiet and still, watching Miss Gwendolyn Bertram watch the moon.
Knock, knock, knock.
The index of his right hand twitched as her eyes dropped their gaze for a moment.
She turned her head a fraction to listen. She spoke.
Ernest could not hear the words, nor guess what they were. He couldn't even imagine the sounds of them in her mouth, having never heard her voice. This fact ached inside him.
His hand clenched as she rose to her feet. He shifted very slightly as she moved towards the door.
He looked at his clock. Tick, tock, tick, tock.
He rose from his chair and placed a hand against his window, his heart racing like a mother who had lost her child on a crowded street.
His clammy fingers left fingerprints on the glass as he stared and stared. Movement. A man.
Hello.
Hello. My name is Thomas Thistle. I'm from next door.
Oh yes, I remember. My name is Gwendolyn.
Well, it's silly, really. I wondered if you might want some company.
Ernest forgot to breathe. His heart began to thunder in his chest, pounding as it tried to escape. Her eyes on him.
Her moon was forgotten.
He pressed his face against the window.
His now boiling breath heaving and wheezing and clouding the glass.
His hands clenched into fists, shaking slightly. He watched as they spoke words he could not hear, as they shared looks, laughs that he could never understand.
Ernest's eyes welled with tears of fury, and he hammered his fist on his window once. As he did so, his mind flickered to the body of his mother, sleeping gently nearby.
He didn't want to wake her.
He strained his ears, heard no sounds of stirring, and so he returned to his watch, his breath now unsteady like an animal.
The man left.
Gwendolyn returned to her darkness.
And the moon rose in the sky.
Thomas Thistle bade Gwendolyn Bertram good night. He had thoroughly enjoyed her company and would dream of her that night. He was almost unaware of the pain that followed him around like a starving dog. It had been silenced by his happiness, pacified by contentment. He moved to his window and switched on the light.
A light appeared in another window.
Ernest saw the man's face.
The man he had been cursing. The man he did not know. He felt a sliver of blood creep from his left thumb and forefinger as he slowly unclenched his fist, allowing the nails to slide out from the grooves they had created in his palm.
In his right hand, he could feel the weight of the knife he had snatched from the kitchen drawer moments before.
Ernest's breath deepened.
The man smiled and sighed.
For a moment, Ernest flinched as the man seemed to stare directly at him. But Ernest knew he could not be seen. Could he?
Thomas stared out of the window, a contented smile upon his face, until something caught his eye.
He blinked, momentarily blinded. From the dark window of a dark building that overshadowed his apartment, there was a light flickering upon his face.
Thomas strained his eyes, trying to detect the source of this light. But whenever he thought he might be able to make out the shape of a figure, it struck him again, flushing his eyes out of focus, fluttering intently around them like a moth around a flame.
A signal? A warning? A cry for help?
Thomas rested on his stick and counted the blocks of the building.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 floors up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 across. On the corner.
Ernest's heart was racing as the man in the building opposite stared directly at him.
How could he see him? How could he know?
The moon high above shone down upon Ernest. Its light caught the blade.
Thomas stood for another second, staring at the source of the light. He then turned and walked out of his room.
He is coming. Ernest stood in the dark and waited, his breath heavy as his nostrils filled with the pungent scent of the fresh hothouse flowers that sat, as they always did, in a vase on the table beneath his mother's portrait. He waited. Tick, tock, tick, tock. He is coming. Ernest's heart began to pound. He pushed himself against his window to get a view of the ground between the two apartment blocks. And he waited.
He saw a shadow of a figure moving towards his building. He clutched his knife and moved towards the door.
He is coming. There was a knock.
Knock, knock, knock!
Ernest heard the knocks and gripped tightly against the doorknob.
Knock, knock, knock!
He pushed himself against his wall and opened the door. He listened and tried to remain still. He could hear the heavy breath of the figure on the other side. 1 step, 2 steps, footsteps crossed the threshold. 3 steps, 4 steps, 5 steps.
Ernest's knuckles whitened around the knife, clutching it. Beetles of sweat scuttled across his brow.
6 steps, 7.
Ernest slammed the door shut, launching himself upon the figure, plunging the knife deep into the back, feeling his blade slip slightly against fragments of spine.
A small, searching glow of moonlight crept into Ernest's apartment. Ernest's heart stopped when he caught sight of the shock of white hair that fell into his arms.
As Gwendolyn went to close her curtains, something caught her eye. A flash, a sparkle, like a star twinkling just for her. She gazed out, her failing eyes struggling to find their target. The star remained, twinkling brightly, shining into her eyes.
Own special star.
Its light caressed her face.
It was calling to her.
Another gift!
She smiled.
It came from a dark window of the dark building across from hers. Straining her eyes to make out the shapes of the windows, she counted the blocks of the building.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 floors up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 across on the corner.
She remained there in the darkness for a moment longer, watching her twinkling star, before turning and walking out of her apartment.
Clutching the railings, she made her way out into the night and down the stairs.
She looked up as she crossed the space between the two buildings and saw the moon high up in the sky looking down upon her.
She followed her star and reached the entrance of the building. She started climbing the stairs.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 floors up.
She counted the doors.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 across on the corner.
She knocked. Knock, knock, knock.
Nothing.
Knock, knock, knock.
Nothing.
Knock, knock, knock.
Nothing.
Gwendolyn turned to leave, but as she did, she heard the gentle creak of a door opening. Her heart fluttered. She stared into the dark apartment. She could see nothing but the thick darkness. She stepped forward. One step, 2 steps.
She crossed the threshold.
3 steps, 4 steps, 5 steps.
She looked around, trying to find her star.
6 steps, 7. Gwendolyn's eyes opened wide as she felt the knife enter her mouth. Her mouth dropped open as she struggled to breathe. She could not scream. Her lungs refusing to inflate as they snatched at the stale air of the apartment.
a strange feeling in the pit of his stomach, fueling his curiosity.
From behind walls of bric-a-brac he uncovered a small tin box.
He opened the box. A tobacco tin, some letters, photographs.
His military-issue handgun.
He froze, like a child confronted with the ghost of a long-forgotten fear.
The gun, which had never been fired.
He suddenly felt a sharp pain in his right leg. A scream from the shard of shrapnel that was now becoming a piece of him.
Biting away his pain, he pushed aside the handgun and retrieved the old binoculars he sought.
He pulled out his handkerchief and wiped the years of dust from their lenses before heaving himself to his feet and returning to his room.
He walked to the window and counted the blocks of the building.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 floors up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 across on the corner.
Thomas clutched the handle of his cane tightly, and he raised the binoculars to his eyes. He stared inside the dark apartment. A small shaft of moonlight crept inside him.
He saw her, pale as a ghost, her long white hair resting gently on her shoulders.
1 step, 2 steps,
She crossed the threshold.
3 steps, 4 steps, 5 steps.
She looked around.
Thomas thought he could make out the shadow of a figure behind her. He forgot to breathe.
6 steps, 7.
The flash of the blade caught the moonlight, blinding him.
He dropped the binoculars. His heart raced. What had he witnessed? It couldn't be. With shaking hands, he scrambled around on the floor to pick up his father's binoculars. 13 up, 7 across. He returned the binoculars to his fearful eyes.
Thomas saw the face of a man lit by the moon, eyes cold as stone, full of hate.
With hot blood on his hands, Ernest saw the man who should now be dying in his arms, standing there in the opposing apartment, watching him. Ernest drew his curtains shut.
Knock, knock, knock.
Hello?
Mr. Hemmel?
Yes?
I'm sorry to bother you, but we've had reports of a disturbance coming from your apartment.
A disturbance?
Yes, I wonder if I could ask you a few questions.
Questions? What sort of questions?
May I come in?
Yes, of course.
Nice place.
Thank you.
Yours?
Yes. Could I get you anything, a drink?
A drink. A hot drink, if it's not too much trouble.
Tea, perhaps?
Yes, tea would be most sufficient.
It may take a moment for the kettle to boil. The water here is always very cold.
Quite.
May I ask what questions?
We've had reports of a disturbance.
What sort of disturbance?
Are these curtains always closed?
Often, when it's dark out.
Are you alone?
How do you mean?
Have you had company this evening?
No, I.
Reports of a pale young lady.
A pale lady? What's happened to her?
What's that smell?
The flowers.
Ah, a fine-looking woman.
Excuse me?
The painting? A pale lady. Your wife?
No, my mother. She's asleep in the next room.
I thought you said you were alone.
I am alone. She sleeps through. She is not well. I can show you if you like. I'd rather not wake her, if that's okay with you. She is not well.
Of course.
That's the kettle. I should go get your tea.
So it was Thomas who called the police.
Yes, I believe so. He said he saw a murder, saw a young girl killed. But that was several days before Ernest was brought in.
So what happened?
Officer reported him to be a quiet, polite man, sane as a judge. Normal, calm, helpful. Said that the man that he brought in several days later could have been a different person altogether. Described him to be a shell, a cadaver of the man he met that night.
Really? And there was no sign of the girl?
None, not at that time.
So what happened in those few days that passed?
Who knows?
Well, it just doesn't make any sense. How could a normal, seemingly sane human being have been turned into this?
Guilt. It always gets you in the end. A relentless pursuer. You can ignore it, bury it, run from it. But it will just keep hunting you down until it's dragged you into its blackness with it. Tap tap, tap tap, with the warm blood of his victim on his hand, Ernest slowly and carefully, tap tap, he searched for the right spot. Tap.
When he heard the sound of a hollow, his hand stopped.
Carefully, and with the utmost precision, he started to peel back the wallpaper.
He carefully removed the nails from the boards beneath, one by one, and then began prizing away the boards to reveal the musty dark void that lay between the walls. He looked inside.
Black, empty, dead. He looked upon his victim. The shocking red blood screaming against the soft whiteness of her skin.
Ernest's heart was thundering. His mind was racing. A momentary flood of emotion tried to engulf him, but he held it back.
He took hold of her.
She was light and limp in his hands as he placed her into the cavity.
He forced her body into the darkness, crushing her elegant limbs, contorting them into their claustrophobic resting place. She didn't put up a fight as her body was bent and broken into place.
He looked at her pale face one last time, sweat christening his brow and hands shaking with fear and rage and shame. He kissed her cool lips.
At his touch she stirred, as if waking from a deep sleep. She opened her eyes and looked at him. She tried to scream, but her body wouldn't allow it. A desperate plea, a last call for clemency.
Ernest's heart ripped through his chest as he tore her tight fingers from his shirt.
He looked into her eyes, and she looked into his, both now fully grasping the horror of the situation.
He heard a terrible sound coming from her throat, a sound unlike any he had ever heard before. It was animalistic, primal, a dying spirit inside of a broken body. He then began replacing the planks.
He hammered in the nails.
He could hear her scratching against the wood like trapped rats. The sharp, blunt cracks as the soft nails snapped and splintered against the wood. He could hear the dull sound of the numb stumps of her fingers rising at the boards. It stopped, slowly, as if approaching a dangerous creature. Ernest edged closer to the wall, pressing his face up against it to listen. Through the wood, he could just make out the sound of death, the last drops of steam rising from a kettle's mouth.
A gentle gasp, a dying breath, death's rattle.
It had ended. Ernest wiped the knife and returned it to its drawer.
He mopped the blood of his wooden floors
He changed his bloody clothes.
and washed his hands.
Ernest stared at the blank wall. A small shaft of moonlight crept, the shape of a casket, outlining the place where her body lay.
Slowly, he began to notice a tiny speck appearing in the middle of it.
Minuscule, the size of a pinprick. A small insect.
Fear swelling in his stomach, he reached out a finger and touched it. It was wet and hot.
Overcome with fear, Ernest ran to his mother's bedroom and grabbed the portrait that hung above her bed. With urgency and panic, he covered the damn spot that had appeared to torment him.
He stepped back. He clenched his fists to prevent them from shaking.
They retained a slight redness, a flush that would never leave them.
Ernest stared into the eyes of his mother. The clock ticked.
It was a brisk autumn evening when Thomas Thistle first laid eyes upon Gwendolyn Bertram. Before then, he had no idea who inhabited the apartment next door. The only sign of life was the occasional sound through the thin walls, and the large white candle that would sit on her doormat at the beginning of each week, like clockwork, before disappearing, never to be seen again.
Gwendolyn lived by candlelight. Her eyes were too sensitive for the harsh glare of day. And so, she would spend her existence locked up inside her small apartment, with only a single lit candle for her to see her way. This candle would be delivered to her door each week, like clockwork.
The candles fascinated Thomas, and on this particular autumn evening, he had been overcome with curiosity, and had stationed himself at his door to wait, staring through the tiny peephole at the large white candle sitting expectantly on the opposing doormat. He waited there patiently.
Gwendolyn shuffled through the darkness of her apartment, as she did every week to fetch her candle. She opened the door, and the aggressive light of the hallway attacked her senses. She groped around on the doormat for her candle.
Thomas saw her for the first time. He had never seen anything like her. Those eyes. The very next day, Thomas ventured out and purchased a large white candle. He spent days carefully carving it, ever so delicately, with the razor-sharp edge of his military-issue pocket knife in the image of a pale lady. When the day came, he went to his door, opened it, and, peering around cautiously, he replaced the large white candle with his own before returning to his peephole to wait.
As always, Gwendolyn went to her door to fetch her candle. She opened it, and clutching around in the brightness, she felt it. Her fingers stopped for a moment. She glided her hands over the molded wax, feeling the contours Thomas had painstakingly carved.
Thomas watched on eagerly, almost forgetting to breathe. He saw what seemed to be the soft shadow of a smile appear across her face. Hurriedly, he pulled open the door.
Through the piercing light, she saw him.
They stared into each other's eyes for a moment.
Their hearts stopped.
Clocks didn't tick.
Suddenly, Gwendolyn regained herself and shuffled back into her apartment.
This same ritual continued for months. Every week, another perfectly carved visage of her beauty.
And every week, she would sit at her door a moment longer, as if she were aware of his gaze and was rewarding him for his kindness.
They would long to speak,
To say hello,
but each time they would remain there, still, silent,
watching through their peepholes.
until one day, Thomas decided to knock on her door.
Knock, knock, knock. Thomas Thistle sat minutes, hours, days, nights in the darkness, watching the apartment 13 up, 7 across, hoping to catch a glimpse of his love. He begged to go back, to change things. Another loss, another death caused by his inaction.
Ernest sat, minutes, hours, days, nights, staring at the portrait of his mother that hung upon the wall. Shadows of crimson seemed to creep out behind every side of its thick frame.
A cenotaph heralding an unmarked tomb. Sounds of scratching pricked in his ears. His eyelids, like thick syrup, began to drip onto his cheeks, smothering into darkness.
The days passed, and Thomas stared at Ernest.
And Ernest stared at the painting,
And the painting stared back.
Thomas had seen death many times. It is the price of going to war.
But death is a strange creature. Sometimes it will let you pass by freely, and others leaps upon your back, forcing you to carry it until you can go no further before dragging you down into the mud with it.
Thomas remembered shivering in the dark ruins of a derelict building as an enemy patrol searched for him and the remains of his unit. He remembered the moon shining down upon the face of the young private whom they found in the room next to him. The harsh sound of the words they shouted out. Words he didn't recognize, but the meaning of which he understood. He remembered the faltering sound of the boy's voice.
Help! Mercy!
He remembered clutching the handle of his military-issue handgun, trying to move, to stand, to act, it feeling heavy and alien in his shaking hand. He remembered the moment it started to snow, a flicker of beauty amidst the horror. He felt the snowflakes falling on his face. He remembered the sound of a gunshot. Then silence.
With a jolt, Ernest sat bolt upright in his chair, his heart crashing against his chest like a drowning man hammering at the surface of a frozen lake.
his mother's eyes stared back at him from the wall.
Memories dug at Ernest's skull like a hatchet. Guilt and fear pierced his spine like poison-filled incisors. He forced some air into his shallow lungs.
He could not raise his eyes to meet hers, though he could feel them upon him.
He saw the shine of her perfect patent leather shoes, the familiar sight of the hem of her dress, the stockings beneath.
Click, click, click,
Heel on hard wood.
click, click, click.
Ernest tried to tear the unwanted thoughts from his head, pulling at them one by one like strands of hair. But as he pulled, they just got longer and longer.
Click, click.
He closed his eyes and braced himself for an impact.
But it didn't come. The heels of her shoes clicked as she turned and walked away.
Click, scratch, scratch, knock, 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 tick, tock, click, click, scratch, scratch, knock, 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 tick, tock.
Over the past few days, Ernest noticed that the pigment seemed to be draining from his apartment. The carpet, the wallpaper, had all slowly started to lose their color, and now they appeared white, pure white, like virgin snow.
Even the portrait of his mother had started to change. Her face had become paler, as if a terrible fright had caused it to turn pure white, and now you could barely make her out against the stark canvas.
Ernest stared at the painting.
The eyes bore into him.
Ernest couldn't be sure, but it seemed to be moving, almost imperceptibly. It seemed to breathe.
Ernest's heart faltered as he realized the face he was now staring at was not that of his mother, but of a young woman with a shock of white hair.
The eyes of the poor white woman in the picture started to widen, and her breath began to quicken as she tried desperately to fill her lungs, but could not.
Ernest ran to the wall, tearing down the painting, but as he did, he only revealed the scarlet stain behind it.
Scratch, scratch, scratch.
He watched the mark bleed across the wall, spreading like a cancer.
Scratch, scratch, scratch.
Her face, her skin.
Scratch, scratch, scratch.
He felt the hot liquid under his feet.
Scratch, scratch, scratch. Consuming the walls, the ceiling. burn like a swarm of fire, and
The whole apartment drowning in blood.
scratch, scratch, scratch.
Where is she? He ran to his kitchen, dragged open the drawer, and pulled out the knife.
He heard her breath, felt it upon his face.
Scratch, scratch, scratch.
The hothouse flowers attacked his senses. He couldn't breathe. He ran to the window, tore open the curtain, and flung it open.
Ernest felt the icy breeze on his cheek. He filled his lungs, gulping at the fresh night air, his shaking hands clutching the knife as the moon's rays shine down upon him.
Thomas Thistle was stirred from his uneasy slumber. Something was waking him, calling to him. Something he felt it alive upon his face. A signal, a warning, a cry for help. The light that he had seen before, from the night that she died. He looked up at the dark window of the dark building. 13, 7 across. Something sparked inside his chest, a determination. Grabbing at the handle of his gun, he heaved himself to his feet and lurched across the space in between the two buildings, ignoring the shrieking pain as metal drew at the flesh and muscle. He opened the doors and started climbing the stairs, hammering his stick down hard upon each step. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 floors up! He counted the doors. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6.
Ernest heard the footsteps. He clutched his knife tightly in his palm. She is coming.
Thomas gripped the handle of his gun with a vicious intent, as if trying to choke the life out of it. 7 across, on the corner.
She is here.
Bang, bang, bang!
Ernest couldn't bear it anymore. He began scratching and clawing away at the paper with his fingernails, scraping against the wood, pulling out the nails, pricing up the boards, trying to find her, to reveal her, to set her free.
Bang, bang, bang!
Ernest caught his breath.
Bang, bang, bang!
He stared into the blackness.
Bang, bang, bang! The scream that Thomas heard from behind the door would stay with him for the rest of his life. Even amidst the horror of war, he had never heard such a sound emerge from another human being. It filled him with fear and horror and pity.
Unable to battle his morbid curiosity, Thomas slowly forced open the door and raised his gun. The first thing that hit Thomas was the smell.
The moon's rays seeped into the room, and Thomas could just make out the shape of Ernest Hemmel, lying motionless, next to a portrait of a pale lady.
He saw a shock of white hair upon Ernest's head, and an expression on his face that chilled him to his core.
Ernest's right hand twitched involuntarily as the moon high above shone down upon the blade in his hand. The flash caught Thomas's eye. He lowered his gun. It would remain unfired.
It's like he'd seen a ghost. Maybe he had.
And the young girl, the one Thomas Thistle thought he'd seen too.
Oh, she was fine. They found her in his mother's bedroom, tucked up in bed, sleeping. A single puncture wound near her spine, but other than that...
And whose mother?
Thomas followed the shaft of moonlight as it crept up the wall, illuminating the spot where the wallpaper had been torn away and the planks of wood forced aside to reveal a cavity.
Tick, tock, tick.
He forgot to breathe. As through the darkness,
He saw the decaying body of Ernest's mother, her hands and face contorted into their final expressions of fear and desperation.
The moon's rays rested upon her cheek. At peace.
Thomas closed his eyes.
She'd been there for years, hidden in the walls.
His own mother, stabbed in the back.
They reckoned she was alive days after he buried her. The neighbors reported scratching in the walls at the time of her death. But they thought it to be just the rats!
Poor woman.
Tick, tock, tick, tock, tick, tock, ticked the clock as Ernest sat in his cell, staring at the portrait of his mother that stared back. He tried to ignore scarlet stains that glistened around the outside of the frame and the sounds of scratching that echoed in his ear. She belonged to him.